In one of the craziest stories about the transgender culture war that I have read in years, a Brazilian woman is facing up to 25 years in prison for the so-called crime of misgendering, a sentence so onerous that she has been accepted as a political refugee in Europe. She has been given asylum in Europe. They recognize that she faces political persecution. Europe, as any listeners or viewers of The Bridgehead will know, has not been great on the transgender issue for the most part, but even they recognize that this is a truly insane thing that's happening. So to give you a summary, I'm going to use the reporting from Reduxx here. And the reason I mentioned the place that I'm getting the reporting from is because they've done a phenomenal job breaking these stories before anybody else does, as they kind of track what's going on in all these individual countries and the political persecution being leveled against anybody who doesn't believe in gender ideology. And so their lead paragraph is pretty stunning. In a precedent-setting move, a European country has officially granted full refugee protections to a Brazilian women's rights activist who was facing 25 years in jail in her home country for misgendering a transgender politician. Interesting. So trans-identifying politician. This is a man who identifies as a woman. Isabela Cêpa is the first person to be recognized as a victim of state persecution for her outspoken opposition to gender identity ideology. I want to pause here a minute. Like 10 or 12 years ago, most of this stuff was foreign to most people. Most people didn't know what the basic premises of gender ideology was. Most people weren't aware of what transgenderism was all about. Fast forward just a few years, and you have somebody from Brazil fleeing to Europe and being formally recognized as a victim of state persecution because she's facing a potential sentence of a quarter century behind bars for referring to a trans-identifying male as male. Wild. That basically means that I could face 25 years in prison in Brazil for correctly identifying the gender of the politician we're about to tell you about. So as previously reported by Reduxx, Cepa first came under criminal investigation after she made a social media post about Erica Hilton, a male politician who identifies as female. Hilton was elected to the São Paulo municipal government in November of 2020, and he won his seat by a landslide and began referring to himself as the most voted for woman in Brazil. So this is something else to note about trans activists. They claim to want to just be able to get on with their lives, right? I'm a male who identifies as a woman, just leave me alone and let me live my life. That is absolutely not what is actually going on. Trans activists want to force everybody else to affirm their identity. They do so very publicly, and they put themselves in situations where they can actually prosecute, persecute, and force people to affirm their chosen identity. So Reduxx says, at the time of his victory, Hilton was celebrated in international media as being a symbolic triumph for transgender people. Hilton was among the 10 most top voted for candidates in all of Brazil and was touted as the only woman to make the list. It was the widespread announcement of his victory that first put him on Cepa's radar. And so here's what she said during a 2022 interview. At the time, I didn't even know who this person was. I just saw a headline on an Instagram page celebrating the most voted woman in São Paulo as a trans woman. I began to share a video with my followers saying I was disappointed to hear that the most voted for woman in São Paulo, later found out that it was in the entire country, was actually a man. So then Hilton later reported Cepa, who's an outspoken women's rights activist, to the police, and this prompted a criminal investigation. So you have a women's rights activist referring to a man who identifies as a woman, as a man, and then the cops get called, and the cops investigate this as a crime. And then in January of 2022, they summoned her to the police station to interrogate her about this. And that's when she learned that Hilton had actually filed a criminal complaint against her for her social media posts. Again, 10 years ago, we would have considered this stuff to be a kind of a right-wing fantasy version of The Handmaid's Tale, but it's actually happening. After speaking with the police, she was unaware of any further developments in the case until June 2022. And then there was a reporter from a major Brazilian newspaper who contacted her for her comment on charges that were being pressed against her. And she found out from this media article that she was being charged with 5 counts of social racism. That charge, just for context, stems from a 2019 decision by the Supreme Court of Brazil, by the Brazil's Supreme Federal Court is what it's called in Brazil, which ruled that discrimination against the LGBTQ community constitutes a penal offense, and that this fell under the race-based protections as a form of racism. So, referring to a man who identifies as a woman as a man is now in the category of racist, specifically social racism. Now, the public prosecutor actually went hunting for details that he could use to charge this woman for social racism. And so the public prosecutor actually combed through her social media to find additional statements that could be perceived as transphobic. And again, transphobia, which is disagreeing with gender ideology and publicly objecting to its premises, is now considered social racism and is a punishable crime in Brazil. And it's from the news article that Cepa discovered she was facing up to 25 years in jail for this alleged crime. Now, what did she do? Well, she fled the country. In July of 2024, she was stopped at the Salvador Bahia airport while attempting to travel to Spain to visit a friend. Federal agents flagged an alert to her passport. So she wanted to leave the country on vacation to visit a friend in Spain while she was being charged with 5 counts of social racism and facing up to 25 years in prison for calling a trans-identifying male male. And they pulled her aside when she was trying to leave the country for further inspection. Unbelievable stuff. During the subsequent interview, authorities determined that her situation could meet the criteria for political persecution, and so they contacted the airline she had booked with and instructed them not to depart without her on board. So they proactively recognized that what she was going through could potentially result in her receiving political asylum. And an officer escorted her onto the plane and advised her against returning to Brazil. So it wasn't even her idea to seek refugee status. She was advised to seek refugee status. I've been covering this issue for about 10 years, and some of these stories, it's still mind-blowing to me that we're watching them unfold in real time. That you've got, federal agents from Spain meeting with a women's rights activist, advising her to get on the plane, accompanying her onto the plane like she's somebody trying to leave Iran or something like that, and then advising her, don't return to Brazil. You might get locked up for a quarter of a century for calling a man a man. In June 2025, following their advice, she formally applied for refugee status. And Reduxx has now confirmed that Cepa has successfully obtained refugee status with the assistance of the European Union Agency for Asylum, making her the first Brazilian citizen to receive this designation for state persecution since 1985. And why? Because she called a man a man. Reduxx is withholding the name of the official host country to protect Cepa's privacy. So we know her point of entry was, but we don't know which country has given her formal refugee status. It could be any number of countries. Poland would probably give it to her. Hungary would probably give it to her. But this is so egregious. Again, Spain right now has a very left-wing government, but it was a Spanish federal agent who advised her to seek refugee status. So speaking to Reduxx, Matria Brazil, a women's rights organization, welcomed the decision, but understandably voiced frustration with the Brazilian government. So you can be glad that this woman is safe, but she essentially cannot go back to her home country because she could face 25 years in jail for calling a male politician male. Their statement was, Matria has been following Isabela Cêpa's persecution from the very beginning. Together, we exhausted every institutional avenue available within Brazil, always respecting the country's laws and sovereignty, including taking her to a meeting with then Minister for Women, Cida Goncalves, I'm probably mispronouncing the name, so she could present her case in person. The minister showed no concern for her and took no action to protect a Brazilian woman facing political persecution. No other official channel offered any support either. This is crazy. It really is crazy. It, by the way, shows what can happen in a very short amount of time when you elect a left-wing government. So we see the same thing unfolding in other South American countries. They've got conservative governments that kind of reflect the conservative views on life and family that most of the population does. You even have a lot of sort of economically liberal or left-wing politicians running on socially conservative platforms because they recognize that the vast majority of the population is socially conservative. All it takes is one left-wing government and all of that gets turned on its head. So Maitreya said, Cepa was left with no choice but to resort to the last and most extreme measure, seeking political asylum abroad. Maitreya drafted a formal letter in support of her application describing the threats she faced in Brazil. For her safety, we do not have further details, but we can now confirm she is safe in a European country. This is a young woman who is a refugee from state persecution on behalf of trans activists that now has to live in a different continent for fear of persecution in her home country. And Maitreya emphasized the broader significance of the case, noting that it marks the first time an individual has been recognized as facing persecution for their criticism of gender ideology. Cepa is the first Brazilian since the end of our military dictatorship to be granted political asylum on the grounds of state persecution, and the first woman in the world to receive this status for being targeted over her dissent on trans ideology. This is a reality many women face across the globe. It is deeply troubling that in our own country, democracy, freedom of belief, and the freedom of speech appear to no longer apply. Many women, not only Isabella, are being harassed and silenced simply for speaking the truth, that sex matters, and that men cannot become woman by an act of will. Her refugee bid is the first successful bid of the kind, but it will now set a precedent for other individuals facing legal and social repercussions for their gender-critical beliefs. It will now be used as a case of reference by any person in the world facing the same kind of persecution. As previously reported on by Reduxx, and I've been covering this as well, there's been multiple Brazilians facing criminal charges for statements or commentary deemed transphobic, all under the same 2019 Brazil Federal Supreme Court decision that dubs any transphobia as a form of social racism. Earlier this year, women's rights activist Karen Mizuno revealed she had also been notified by the police that she may face criminal charges after mocking a trans activist who claimed that archaeologists are transphobic for correctly identifying people they dig up as male or female. Like, this would be funny, except for the fact that people are actually being prosecuted and put in prison for this stuff. She faces up to 3 years in jail, and in another ongoing case, 2 staff members from the Federal University of Paraíba are fighting criminal charges for allegedly misgendering a transgender student. One of the 2 people being charged was a female janitor who asked an obviously male, a guy in a dress, to leave the female bathroom. So it's hard not to laugh at aspects of the story, except for the fact that you have people being driven out of their country and cannot return to their home country, where their friends and their family are, and where they've lived their whole lives, where they've been raised, where their actual culture is. It's one thing to say, well, I'm glad she's safe in Hungary, Poland, or whatever European country granted her asylum. It's another thing to think that, she's now in a very different country with a very different culture, and she cannot return to Brazil because she might go to jail for a quarter of a century. Everything those of us who warn about transgender totalitarianism have been saying is not only true, but it's worse than we thought it would be. 25 years for misgendering, I've got to say, despite the fact that we've seen a lot of cases like this happening on a smaller scale in the UK, veterans arrested for social media posts, a Scottish construction worker fined massively by a Scottish court for laughing at a man in a dress. We've seen cases like that. This really is gulag level crackdown stuff. And all of us should be paying attention to these stories very, very carefully. Thank you so much for joining The Bridgehead. We hope you found it helpful, as always. If you enjoyed it, please do like the video, share it around, subscribe, tell your friends to subscribe, leave a comment. You can heckle or harass me in the comments. And if you have some ideas of subjects you really think that we should be covering, you can drop those too. Otherwise, you can find us wherever you get your podcast content. Thanks so much for listening.